Good. So we're continuing in this series on worldviews, and my hope is it might be optimistic, but this week or certainly by next week we'll finish the isms, and we're going through these isms, like materialism, to help us understand where people are coming from today. Uh, the evolution of the way people think has been on a trajectory, but what you find today is a bit of a hodgepodge sometimes. Someone might fall into a specific category, but a lot of times they've grabbed ideas from different places. But all these ideas about how to think and how to explain the world are natural developments when you begin from the hypothesis there's no God, no creator, and you end up with these things. So we want to understand those things. We want to be able to go up to our own Mars Hill, like Paul in Acts 17, with some understanding of where the culture's coming from. My goal is not to win arguments, but it is to understand people I'm talking to and be able to engage them and ask questions and hopefully begin to point them toward Christ through healthy dialogue. Some people are not going to be willing to do that, but a lot of people are. A lot of people simply haven't thought about these issues. They hold beliefs that we may be talking about in the prior lessons or today, but it's not because they've thought about it or spent a whole lot of time systematizing it. Now, some have, but we're really in a day in our culture where a lot of people are a few generations removed from some more Christian roots that may have been held by great grandparents or something like that. And it's not so much that they've intentionally rejected anything as haven't thought about it. And so anyway, we're going through that. I'll share my screen and where we want to end up after we finish these isms is strategies for having these actual conversations and kind of understanding how we might do that effectively, at least to those who are willing to talk. So um, last week, the isms we covered were materialism, empiricism, and rationalism. Just reminding you what those are. It's important to recognize that all of these isms are attempts to provide a comprehensive worldview, a way of thinking about reality. And if you exclude the idea of a creator God, you exclude Genesis 1 and 2, then a lot of these make sense, particularly materialism, that nothing exists except physical matter, molecules in motion. This was a widely held view for a long time, and it's still widely held today. Empiricism is really an offshoot of materialism. It's closely linked with a word we can also use today called scientism, the idea that the only truths are those that can be known through the scientific method. Empiricism grounds all knowledge in the scientific method, so things that can be empirically verified. Um, Rationalism departs from these and says, no, 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 it's not all just things that can be empirically determined. It's things from reason and logic. But now that reason and logic still excludes God. But it's the idea that instead of empiricism or science being the sole source of truth, there might be other ways of getting at truth that are superior to um, empiricism. Now, from a biblical worldview, all these explainers are reductionistic. They leave something out, but we also need to make sure we recognize that they're not all completely false in the sense that we can gain truth through empirical science, right? What we're denying is it's the sole source of truth, not that science and empiricism can't deliver up some truth. Rationalism, reason, and logic. We're not denying that you can come to truth through reason and logic. We're just denying that you can come to all truth that way. It's leaving something out. So that's kind of the idea. But what you're seeing today is some people will cleanly fall into one camp, but more likely they're going to have borrowed from all of these and some others that we'll go through here in a moment. So, relative to a biblical worldview, though, they're reductionistic, and what that means is we can find things that materialism, empiricism, rationalism cannot fully account for. They don't have an explanation. And so we always have to ask the question, are these adequate explainers or adequate answers? Are they adequate worldviews? Do they have explanatory power? And we should think through the implications. I was reading a book this week, and it has a chart in it, which I didn't copy, but I've adapted it. It's close to a copy, but the formatting's different. And I'll show you the book at the bottom. It's called God, the Science, the Evidence, the Dawn of a Revolution. And I've got the authors listed down there whose names I can't pronounce. But it's been a very good book. They reject biblical creationism, but they are arguing for biblical creationism in the sense of 6 literal days. They're arguing against materialism and for creation ex nihilo, that God exists, the God of the Bible exists, that He created everything out of nothing. And it's a book with a lot of chapters on scientific advances. Now they're taking as true some of these advances that I know some people might not, but they also look at philosophy and logic and that sort of thing. And so they're pulling truth from multiple sources. But what I liked about the table is it reminds us that with whatever worldview you have, the worldview has implications. And those implications can be tested against what we see. So on the left column here is your materialistic worldview. If nothing exists except the material universe, things composed of atoms and so forth, then what follows? Well, one is the universe can't have an absolute beginning. And just think about that for a moment. It's interesting that 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago, scientists widely held that the universe was eternal. It had no beginning, and that gave them a safe haven because you couldn't be mainstream science and believe in a creator God, because that would a creator God, the creation has a beginning, the universe has a beginning. And so you see in the right-hand column, if the universe originates from a creator, then it has a beginning and has a purpose, right? So you can think of a couple of things that created a real problem, and it was immediately perceived it was a real problem. That is scientists came up, and I won't go through all that history in detail. The book has it, but it was a theory that later got called in the 1950s or so. It got called the Big Bang Theory, but it really goes back several decades before then. It wasn't called that by those who argued for it. But what they were dealing with was some of Einstein's theories and an error he had made in some of his equations. And as they started to figure that out, they said, this universe they think is expanding, and that led to some other discoveries. And then this guy named Hubble had this big telescope that's very famous, and they were able to capture this idea of the red shift that was sort of this effect on the light that we're seeing through the telescope caused by the universe expanding, etc. So you had this Big Bang theory, and not I'm not here to advocate or refute Big Bang, only to say that this theory developed in the 1900s and later became widely accepted by mainstream science, but not early on. But the reason, it's interesting to note the reason that it met such resistance. I mean, it met a lot of resistance, was because they immediately recognized that the Big Bang Theory meant that there was a beginning of the universe. And so the concept of a moment before then would be that there wasn't the universe or space and time before that. And they immediately perceived that that suggested a creator, not necessarily the God of the Bible, but it certainly would line up with it. And one of the guys that was pushing this theory was a Catholic priest, and so it was easy to say, well, he's just cooking up something to support the Book of Genesis. But they perceived this issue that the implication of materialism is that you cannot have a universe with a beginning. And so this while materialism still widely held, it sort of ran headlong into its own discoveries, as it were. Um, and the second one they listed here, thermal death, that's another scientific idea. If you take out Big Bang to its ultimate conclusion, an expanding universe that's also aging, and stars age. Our sun will age, and supposedly, eventually it will begin to run out of fuel, as it were, right? Because it's burning hydrogen and expelling helium and some other stuff, but it will run out of fuel. But it will grow. It'll go supernova, as they call it, and it'll envelop the Earth, and we all die. Now it's billions of years ahead of time, at least on their time schedule. But here's the problem, right? If the sun could run out of fuel, the universe had to have a beginning, right? Because if the universe were infinite, it would have already run out of fuel, right? If the universe had no beginning, the sun has a finite amount of fuel, it would have run out a long time ago. I mean, it's all philosophical to talk about when, but that makes some sense. So again, science, mainstream, talking about the universe ending in a so-called thermal death when it runs out of fuel and planets burn up because of supernova stars and all that, and then it all turns cold after that. But uh, you know, that also meant it had a beginning. Dan?
Yeah, since you have a background in math, maybe you can comment on this. I remember hearing an argument against the universe being infinite from mathematics. Something
Yep.
about you can't have an infinite regress going backward.
That's right. Infinity is something that mathematicians define. It's a concept that makes sense to us. Remember that mathematics is a branch of philosophy, so we can define anything we want. That doesn't mean it exists in the real world. Although the concept of infinity is fundamental to several branches of mathematics, including calculus, and calculus helps us solve problems in the real world. It helps us model things, but it doesn't mean infinity exists as an actual number. And what I mean by that is when you talk about material things, whether it's planets, grains of sand, blades of grass, apples, whatever they are, you can't have an infinite number of them. You have to think about that for a while because some people would argue you can, but you really can't have an infinite number of them. And there's an implication of that. If there's no such thing as an actual material infinite number of anything, that we can't say we have infinite grains of sand in the universe. It may be a lot of sand in the universe, but hypothetically it could be counted. It's never infinite. That means that the universe cannot have an infinite number of days that it's aged. All right, it's the two are connected, right? And so the universe has to have a beginning. If the universe could be an infinite number of days old and somebody could have lived in that universe all that time, every day they could have made a scratch on a rock or whatever, and you could have an infinite number of scratches on the rock. But no one can come up with an example of any infinite. And a famous illustration that's usually used to this, and I'm forgetting the mathematician's name. I think his last name is Hobbs or Hobson. But imagine a hotel that has a sign out on it that it has no vacancy, is completely full, but it has an infinite number of rooms. You show up to the hotel and you argue, well, wait a second, you're telling me you've got an infinite number of rooms, but you have no vacancy, they're all full. Take the person, take all the people in room one and put them in room two, and take the people in room two and put them in room three, people in room three, put them in room four, and so forth. Now room one is open, and I can take it. So now you've got a vacancy, and you've still got an infinite number of rooms, and they're still all full. The hotel had a vacancy and no vacancy at the same time. I may be getting too far in the philosophical But just that you chew on
I heard
that.
that. I've heard that before too. It's a good argument.
Well, it's an easy way to because in mathematics, and I mean this is getting the things you didn't know and didn't want to know. Infinity is not the biggest number. A guy named George Cantor invented a field of mathematics that improved. He proved, and again, it's all philosophical. You can't find these things. You can't buy an infinite number of stuff. But what he showed was that you can have a set. Set's just a collection of things. You can have an infinite set that is bigger than another infinite set, meaning there are different levels of infinite. And that opens up all kinds of ideas if you start trying to think about what we mean when we say God is infinite. But one thing's for sure, we have no, we talk about infinity very, very easily, especially in mathematics, but we don't really have a good grasp of it. Maybe I could say it that way, a comprehensive grasp. And yet, many people want to think they've got God, who's presented as being infinite in a lot of ways. We kid ourselves into thinking we've got all of Him grasped. And the Apostle Paul made that clear that we don't. We look through a mirror dimly. It's we have a lot of limitations. But yeah, but because philosophically, and if you haven't ever looked into this stuff and you want to, we might talk about it in more detail another time. But um, you can search the Kalam argument, Kalam argument. It's been popularized by a guy named William Lane Craig, but it's nearly 1,000-year-old argument invented by some Muslim philosophers arguing from making this argument I just made. If there's no actual infinites, the universe has to be finite in duration. If the universe is finite in duration, there has to be a creative agent. Something caused it to exist. What can we infer about the cause of this finite universe coming into existence? Just take it a step further. Can we say something more than just a causal agent?
You can say that cause is all powerful.
Yes, yes. All right. What else can
Or
we
or
say?
or at least extremely more powerful than anything we know.
Uh-huh. And what else can we say?
That it's a person
And how would we infer a person?
because the creatures of this creator are also persons,
Hmm.
and you can't be better than what made you.
Yeah. But go back in time. Think about before, it's hard to talk about because time as we conceive it and space don't separate it. Space and time go together. So it's hard for us to talk about before the creation event. But if we think of it that way, so there's no universe yet. What would imply that the creative agent is a person and not, for example, just some sort of, automatic sort of impersonal, mechanical sort of cause.
Because it's a father and a son, there's a relationship.
Yeah, but would you pull it in the Bible? So
Oh,
put your philosopher hat on and think about this. There's no universe, and then there's a universe, and there's some causal agent. Cheryl?
Because if you look at the created universe, there is such intricacy, such detail, such beauty, such beyond anything we could even imagine.
Hmm.
So this takes a mind, this takes a thinking mind
Hmm.
to do this. And not only that, but things are so perfectly in balance. So it's a thinking mind who knew what he was doing.
Yep. It reflects decisions, right? It reflects, in a sense, artistry. And if you imagine, and this isn't I didn't create this example, but I've always thought it's a good one. It may be William Lane Craig's example. He certainly used it in a book. If you go back before there's a universe, if there wasn't a person who made a decision to create, then there has to be another causal, agent there that's not a person. But the question is sort of like what changed so that there wasn't a universe, then there was. If it's not a decision, it has to be a non-decision, and yet there still has to be some kind of change so that all of a sudden the universe exists. And the illustration he uses is, and this is for most of the people on this call, we remember the old days when you had something called an ice tray and you filled it with water and put it in the freezer, and lo and behold, an hour and a half later, you had ice. It's the universe is essentially the frozen ice tray. The ingredients for the frozen ice tray are the water, the tray, and freezing temperatures and some time. Okay. But if you had the ice tray and you had the water and it was in the freezer, then the universe is already existing. It's if you had all the ingredients necessary to make the universe before the universe was made, for example, the freezing temperature and the water and the ice tray, then you would already have a universe. There's no mechanism then that makes it. It just gets you one step back to say, okay, then how did these ingredients that would cause the universe to exist, these non-personal ingredients, how did they get there and come together at that moment in time, right? Because it didn't always exist. It had to happen in a moment in time. Something had to change. And it's hard to explain how there could be a change without a decision. It's hard to explain how just mechanically or by chance. The other thing, keep in mind, before the universe, there's no matter, right? Matter, atoms, material substance. There's none of that. Where the pre-universe is is a universe with nothing physical. And you see how this really gets you back into, wait a second, maybe that old dude Moses had something he knew. God is spirit, right? No one's seen him any time. Makes sense. You need an immaterial God if there's no material universe at that point in time to create it. So and anyway, so these are all good thoughts. I wanted you to see these. There's implications of materialism, and what's interesting is they run headlong into science, Big Bang, thermal death. They run headlong into philosophy, which is this argument we've been philosophizing, or I have, some would just say babbling about it, but there's really you can formalize these arguments for a universe of finite duration and infer a creative agent, not necessarily the God of the Bible, but a God that's a person that's immensely powerful, that's immensely ordered because the creation is mathematically ordered. You can infer these things, but we're talking philosophy, arguably some theology, but really philosophy. And so these different sources of truth come to bear, and they make it very difficult for materialism. Okay. And then that's putting aside things like miracles. In a material universe, there really can't be miracles because everything just has to be guided by sort of the laws of physics and nothing else. And miracles sort of come in as that thing when the so-called laws of science don't necessarily hold, dead people coming back to life, that sort of thing. So there are implications of both views. Last time, I wanted to mention Immanuel Kant just because he's very influential, and he kind of came in. We've got empiricism, materialism, rationalism, but he really pushed back on that with what's called idealism. He would say that the empiricism, everything is, gets scientifically discovered and measured, traps us, well, we're sort of trapped in our minds because we don't even know if we can trust our senses, right? There is an underlying assumption in science that we can trust our observations. And also, I've said this before, science rests on a philosophical basis because the very statement that all truth can be demonstrated scientifically is itself a philosophical statement. So we end up trapped inside our minds. That is, even though it gives this facade of being just numbers, and it's an exercise of observing the real world, and it does involve that. There are some assumptions, and what if our senses aren't trustworthy, for example? Rationalism, remember, was, it's not, it's a different end of the spectrum than empiricism. Rationalism said, logic and philosophy are the way we find out truth. They're the ultimate arbiters of truth, and that's reductionistic as well. But you know what? Sometimes our philosophy, our ability to logic things out, is not as good as we think it is. And it's one of the most dangerous parts of doing theology. It's not improper to talk about inferences from things in the Bible, but a lot of people have built entire broad theories and worldviews on some inferences from how they understand certain Bible text where there are no explicit Bible texts, right? So enter thoughts like limited atonement and irresistible grace, that you really got nothing to work with except the inferences, and so we have to be careful about those. But that's what rationalism taught, and so here you've got Immanuel Kant saying no, reality as we perceive it is really just a construction of the human mind, and it kind of follows from the first bullet. If the scientists and the rationalists are really trapped in the confines of their minds. There's a limitation on what their ability to explain everything, and the limitation is their mind. Maybe the mind is the real reality, and that's kind of the idea here. Instead of the mind perceiving reality, reality is a construct of our minds. However we, you know, put it together, our minds are really the determiner of reality. It only appears to have order with cause and effect because our minds have ordered it that way. Maybe other people would order it differently. It has an obvious problem that um, your mind may order it different than mine, but it also begs the question of whether, if reality is in my mind, I don't know if you actually exist or my mind just created you. It has some problems. Alvin Plantinga, who's a Christian philosopher and one of the big influences on William Lane Craig. A lot of people haven't heard of this guy because he's a little further back in time, but William Lane Craig is very has been very popular for a while, and this was someone he speaks of often. But he's a Christian philosopher. He said the fundamental thrust of Kant's Copernican revolution is that the things of the world owe their fundamental structure and perhaps their very existence to the noetic activity of our minds. And that has lots of implications if it's sort of all in our head. Because the mind imposes order, space, time, etc., it logically follows the mind is outside of time, and therefore itself limitless and timeless is the idea. The mind, you see in all of these views, um, God has been replaced with something that we're calling an idol, to use the structure of Romans 1. Materialism replaces God with the creation. Rationalism creates God, replaces God with just good old-fashioned reason and logic. And idealism replaces God with our mind. It becomes the new idol. And it's it's called idealism because ultimate reality is in the realm of our ideas in our head. And that's the God substitute that we find. And all these theories, they got to have a God substitute because they begin from the premise of no creator God. Now may not be a conscious premise. One may simply have never thought about it, but they do have that premise. Can we step outside of our mind to test the ideas? right? Can we test the ideas? Well, if it's all in my head, I can't step out of it to make sure that in any sense that the that reality outside of my mind uh, in conformity with my mind, if that makes sense. Dan?
Yeah, I don't think this is right because if it's all in my mind, then how come you do stuff I don't want you to do? How come you can make decisions that go against what I want?
It's just what your mind constructed. It's you may think you didn't want it, but it's what you've constructed, right? But but you're right. It's hard to, it has all of these views suffer from the idea that when you're reductionistic, you're leaving something out. And when I say leaving something out, it causes you to struggle to explain certain things, like the one you pointed out, explaining, if I'm really forming reality in my mind, then explaining, you know, my enemies, um, after all, my mind only knows its own contents. I can't know
Or
whether your mind is real. So I get it's sort of another trap.
or
And
or how come I do things even I don't think I ought to do?
yeah, yeah.
Why how come it isn't ideal for me?
And it's one of these things where the problem is all of these need to have some explanatory power. All of these do have some truth. That is the whole reason we're even talking about worldviews is that we come to the world around us with certain um, preconceptions or ideas that may or may not be right. We hope we've gleaned them from the Bible, but they do shape how I interpret reality. But the difference is the Christian is saying these ideas that shape my perception of reality are sourced in God, who has made special revelation. They're not sourced in my mind itself. They have an outside source. And with idealism, they wouldn't have that outside source. Um,
Yeah, as it sounds like that first bullet point there on the screen, that sounds like they're describing God's mind. And I
yeah.
would argue that we have like a little miniature version of that, although ours is corrupted. But
Hmm.
we can perceive these things because the mind gave us a mind.
Yeah. It's it's a there's a sensibility to all of this stuff once you set off on a quest to explain reality without God and without his special revelation. Once you exclude that, these ideas have a certain amount of sense to them. And, you know, Kant could look at the empiricist and see the shortcomings, just like we can. Science is great. It explains lots of things. Doesn't explain everything. And you could see those shortcomings and realize, okay, then this isn't enough. There's got to be something more or something superior as an explainer, you know? And that's the same thing rationalism would do. The Romantics, just quickly, 18th and 19th century, kind of an intellectual artistic movement. These intellectual artistic movements, because I'll mention a couple others in a second that we've all heard of, they influence the broad population. But just these guys, and you had a lot of literature that came out of this, and if you've studied literature, high school and college, they make you read this kind of stuff. They emphasized emotion over reason. Now that should sound familiar. Intuition over instinct, or intuition and instinct over logic and science. That's you can when I said earlier, folks today aren't going to necessarily cleanly fall into one of these isms, but they're likely to borrow from them. And what we often see are people who borrow from this romantic notion, emphasizing emotion, feelings. That's very popular today. In
Yeah,
fact,
the
people
yeah,
tend to tie their identity to their feelings.
yeah, the word they use today to describe this is they call it vibes.
Yeah.
If you hear young people talking about vibes, this is what they're talking about.
And the other part is that I think one of the biggest developments in education has been that people are not and often not cognizant of it, but they're not thinking in terms of framing arguments with premises and a conclusion. They just frame conclusions and seem to think that that's the end of it. That you just frame the conclusion. It's consistent with your intuition, what you feel, what you'd like to be true. And that's the way we have this intuition and instinct over logic and science. This is very common. And it's the reason that if I'm having the conversation with this person, nobody can live out this way consistently. That is, that no one can live in a way where they never look to evidence, right? You ask yourself for some evidence about whether the light is on in the room before you make a decision to flip the switch. We don't live just on intuition and emotion, but you ask people, what led you to this viewpoint? Tell me how you kind of got to where you're at. You ask those questions, and people may have never thought about them, but someone has wisely said, and I'm trying to remember who it was. It was probably Nancy Piercy, but not in that book I recommended, Defining Truth. I think it was one of her others. But I think she's the one. She pointed out that, when you take the conclusion as a belief, even if you have never thought through the argument, you're implicitly taking the argument that's required to get there. And if you're pushed to explain or defend your view, you'll sort of find yourself making that argument. It's a powerful statement because there are implications from what we believe, not only corollaries to what we believe, but as we accept a view like materialism, we accept certain predicates or premises that would lead to that view. Those premises may not be true, but we sort of take them in even if we haven't thought about them yet. And as we try to think through those ideas, because of our having accepted materialism, we will accept those premises if we think about them or if we're pushed to think about them. So these guys emphasized individualism, which is very big today. You can see how and it's somewhat in the American psyche to be individualistic, independent, and that kind of thing. Now, emphasizes it doesn't mean that people actually are independent, though, right? Like, um, I just it's an observation. People think a lot of young people think that they're sort of doing their own thing, going their own way. I'm being my own person. But I'm looking at this group of people saying you're all dressing alike, listening to the same music, watching the same movies, and wearing the same ink on your arms. And I'm not criticizing any of that. I'm saying that you think you're wildly different and you're really like standing out as a unique person. You're not going, you're not, just part of the crowd, and you absolutely are. You're just like that. And that's troubling when I see it among church folks who are exactly the same. And anyway, I could stir the pot and try to offend a bunch of people, but you start looking around, the truly the person that really will sort of do their own thing, be that's really a unique and will stand apart, is a rare person in a lot of ways. But think about Jesus Christ. He Well, certainly growing up, he's a Jewish man, there's Jewish customs, but when you look at him in totality, he is contrary to his culture and every culture at every time that's ever existed, because every culture at every time that's ever existed is a culmination of sinners. And he's not. And he didn't fit within his culture completely, even being Jewish and holding some of those customs as the unique God man, as being actually holy. They had to kill him. He really was different. How rare that is. But take that a step further. If we're really pursuing Christ, if we're really being transformed to be Christ-like, we really will stand out from our culture in a way that's materially different. And it doesn't matter what country you live in, what sort of your demographics are, you will stand out because there has never been a culture that Jesus just fit in like all the rest and looked just like them. He always looked very different, and but nature being God. So we have this idea of emphasizing or valuing individualism, but the reality is we have an inherent need that God created for us in Genesis for community, and we'll find other people who are of like mind, and so that's what you see. The imagination is the creator of truth. It's interesting, this idea that you can create truth. But that might strike us as odd. But again, think about what you're seeing today. This romantic movement, didn't really go away. The pieces of this, the evidence of this are all around us, and people really have this idea that I kind of create my own truth
Yeah.
through feelings, you know. So the Enlightenment, or the so-called Age of Reason, and the views of Romanticism do fit well within the modern age. I wanted to mention Darwinism quickly. Now, a lot can be said about Darwinism. I'll say this: I reject evolution, but that discussion about why is for another time. Um, I will say when Darwin published his book, and you should note the title because it's not published under the original title anymore. But when he published his book in 1859, the concept of evolution already existed historically. There was a guy earlier in that century named Lamarck who dealt with it, and evolution was sort of presumptive within some old pagan views. But what Darwin added that was really new is mentioned in the title, is this idea of natural selection, that just in the environment, people and anything alive adapts and according to the environment and changes. And the idea of natural selection in so-called survival of the fittest was more the idea, not that necessarily the strongest survive, but those who are most able to procreate. And so he observed, for example, the famous finches, the birds, that during a time of drought, the birds with longer beaks survived better because they were better able to get to water and food than the others. And so they procreated and created other finches with longer beaks and that sort of thing. Most people don't deny that as a concept. What has been the struggle historically for Darwinianism is to show an actual change in species, not an adaptation where birds get longer beaks for a while, and then when the drought is gone, it basically goes back to normal after that. It's the movement from species to species, and he recognized when he wrote his book that the existing fossil record did not support his view. He thought it probably would at some point later, particularly because of the Cambrian explosion that you can read about, where in the fossil record a lot of the more complex animals just sort of pop on the scene, as opposed to seeing a bunch of transitions. But what this book did, it was immensely popular, by the way. It was not necessarily well received by all the scientists at the time. This was received by some, but rejected by some others. In the United States, let me think his name. I'm forgetting the first name. His last name is Argosys. We had a famous, like the most famous naturalist scientist in the United States was this guy Argosys, and he fought Darwinism to the day he died. But a lot of church leaders stepped up and embraced it right away, by the way. The idea that Darwinism somehow came and I don't know, and most people were surprised to know that lots of Christians embraced it right away. I'll just say it that way. So we'll leave it at that. But that all said, the idea was the diversity of living things developed or evolved over the course of generations through this natural selection process, survival of the fittest, and so forth. If you think about it, though, Darwinism is exceptionally logical if you start from the premise of no creator God. You got to explain how people got here, right? Now, he doesn't explain how life got here in the beginning so much as how if there is something alive, it would evolve over time. Okay. But just thinking about it logically, without a creator God making humanity, you got to come up with something. And you could either argue that everything just is, it just sort of popped into existence, or you might argue something like Darwinism. There's not a whole lot of choices for how you explain not only life, but the variety of life we have on this planet when you remove a creative agent from the picture. And this was a logical way of doing it. And a lot of because there have been significant challenges to Darwinism, you'll find that a lot of people that believe it, uh, if they're uninformed, they just assume there's mounds of evidence somewhere. But the informed people believe it because of the logic of it. A lot of scientists believe it because of a premise of no creator God. In the absence of him, this is the only alternative, and so it must be true. We'll eventually find the evidence, but it must be true. So just a way of thinking, it gave atheists a scientific stamp of approval in a way that they really needed because they always had to deal with the challenging argument of, if you want to see evidence of God, look around you. Look at the 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 sophistication of animals and people and all the variety of trees and all that. And so this removed that argument and replaced it with science. And you get that kind of idea of the God of the gaps. We don't need this amorphous God to explain why life is here. We've got Darwinism. Um, the questions I ask, though, just to think about this, how do you arrive at moral principles under a Darwinian assumption? Okay, so,
Might makes right.
yeah, maybe, right? Um,
You don't,
yeah.
because you have no source. You have no consistent source.
And so where you end up with is a majority of people, at least in a democratic society, or in a monarchy or a totalitarian government, whatever elitist group is in charge, will determine what's right. It's very hard, and this is the so-called moral argument for the existence of God that we're not going to dive deep into that now, but it's very hard to explain moral principles. I would argue you simply can't. You can't if Darwinism is true, you cannot defend that any particular thing is right or wrong except to refer to relative effects. So if you say that murder's wrong, you're going to say, well, you've deprived a family of their breadwinner. If you murder the father or the mother or both, right? And so that's wrong. You've deprived them of a breadwinner. But that's purely relative terms, and you really haven't. You're not showing it's wrong. You're just pointing out a corollary. Why does it matter if they don't have their breadwinner? Why does it matter if the children go hungry? Like, why is that wrong? I mean, and it shows the obvious problem. Most people think it is wrong, but they believe this at the same time. And we have to accept that human beings, all of us, including all of us on this call, are very capable of believing entirely inconsistent things at the same time. And a lot of people get a lot of bad theology because they think people cannot believe entirely inconsistent things at the same time. And so they say, if we believe A, you must believe B. Not necessarily. You say, well, B follows from A. Doesn't matter. I can believe A and not B. That's part of being human. But it's very hard, impossible to come up with it. And you think about it, this has big implications. I sent a letter yesterday on a pro bono case, someone I've known for years who resides as a guest of the state of Wisconsin on two homicide convictions. On what basis do we send a person to jail on a homicide conviction? On what moral basis? And someone will say, well, I don't want them to kill again.
Evidence?
Well, there would be evidence they did it, but who cares, right? I mean, after all the people were who died, the victims, we call them the victims, they're just um, some chemicals, a couple of dollars of chemicals and some gallons of water. Like, why is there a moral value attached to the person that makes it wrong? We can all just agree it's wrong, but the problem with that, and history's
Because
shown
it
it,
could be yourself, because it could be me.
well, we don't, you're right. What you're getting to is the part that we can't live this worldview out consistently because there's lots of the eggheads in the universities who are arguing exactly what I suggested. There are no moral wrongs, which is why abortion before or after the baby's born is perfectly fine. But no one really lives that out consistently because when it's their child or their person that's being murdered, then they want some justice. Or when it's their car being stolen, which is not a is you can't attach a moral principle to stealing under Darwinianism. They want some justice, but just there are implications. And my point is that this is like, and it's really true of all the isms. No one can consistently live it out. They will hold beliefs that are inconsistent, and that's one of the areas that we can explore in a conversation. How would you, how would you argue that it's wrong to kill? Remember this, I mentioned it vaguely before, but most people today will agree with you that slavery is wrong. Most people today have virtually no knowledge of slavery beyond some caricatures and certainly no historical knowledge. But until the 18th century, until the 1700s, you don't find anybody anywhere suggesting it's wrong. Even the people who were themselves slaves, in a change of circumstance, they become the slave owners. But they didn't like being slaves, but they didn't view it as being like a moral wrong. It was just a part of life. And my point's a simple one. If it's merely the majority of people determining what's morally right or wrong, that can change very quickly and very easily. Is whole civilizations, and it wasn't just Western civilization, it was Eastern as well and Middle Eastern, whole civilizations and in multiple ethnicities carried out slavery for thousands of years, and nobody ever thought it was wrong. Now we say it's wrong. That's the problem. In a universe with no creator God, we can really make anything moral or immoral. Um, and the last question here, I just to mention this, I'm not going to try to build a big argument on it, but to say this, um, the Darwinian thinkers that are writing papers and books, scientists and philosophers, and this is largely true of all of materialism, but it's definitely true of Darwinianism, is now they struggle trying to explain how moral principles evolved, but they all deny free will. I mean, just as a general, I'm not saying that all people that think evolution happened deny free will, but those who are the thinkers doing the science, writing the papers, have largely come to as a logical conclusion of Darwinism that you have no free will. In fact, if you study history and you look at pagan religions that had no creator God like the Bible, they may have had these gods with a little g, Zeus and Athena and stuff. They don't believe in free will. It's broadly the philosophies throughout time, most of them don't believe in free will. It's interesting that the reformers got it right in aligning Christianity with all Darwinianism and all the pagan philosophies. One more here, and then we're close to the end. We'll be able to tie it up next time and move into let's now make this practical and how do we talk to people. But I had to mention I'm not going to say a lot about Hegel, but Hegel is a famous German philosopher, and his views and he was a materialist, but his view of reality was essentially that every thesis, every proposition of truth, eventually there's something to oppose it called an antithesis or antithesis, because there's some problem with it. It doesn't hold up true all the time, and then you meet the antithesis, and as you bring them together, it sort of evolves through synthesis to a new and refined truth. Okay. And a guy named Karl Marx he adapted this, and it's called dialectical materialism. The dialectical part's from Hegel. The materialism is Karl Marx was a materialist, and all socialist and communist governments have tended toward materialism and atheism. That's just a fact. But I just want to
Yep.
mention Marx because he's been so influential, and he's influential today. I mean, it's I don't know why people pretend to be shocked when they hear the mayor of New York say something that's just right out of the playbook, but they do. They pretend to be, surprised. Um, Marx argued that material and economic conditions drive change. That's his sort of thesis and antithesis is that these truths about the way things work economically are going to have an antithesis and they're going to evolve and the way he saw it going was that through all these conflicts, the conflicts are what brings the synthesis and the evolution. We would have society evolve through class struggle. That would be the conflict because the old views, capitalism, are inadequate. He split society into two groups. I'm going to call it the rich folks and the working class, the proletariat. Um, Recognize that this kind of thinking, while from Marx it was economics, okay, and you could read the Communist Manifesto is the one people hear of, but that's not the one that has he's got a 3 volume set called Capital. That's the set of books on Marxism. His partner had to finish them, but it's there, and it's an economic theory. It doesn't work, but it's an economic theory. But it pits two groups against each other is sort of mortal enemies. And that idea of the oppressors and the victims is so prevalent today. And it's a way in which this thinking of Karl Marx, which was in an economic sphere as an economic theory, has come through today where we have so many victims and always new gender labels and other things, and then people are oppressed. Everything's a civil rights movement trying to make things look like the civil rights movement, in the United States over race issues, but bringing it into these other spheres so that we've got this war, this battle, and the only way in Marxism to overcome it was a revolution, which is what critical theory, which is rooted in the same kind of thinking, seeks. So he argued that competition and unemployment sort of keep the poor people poor, and ultimately that's going to bring about this great revolution that replaces capitalism. That'll be the synthesis part of this with a socialist or communist system. And in practice, and what I wanted to, the reason I included this, and this is the slide where we'll stop, is in practice, where you've had this tried, that is Marxism put into place. Lenin in Russia, Lenin had read Capital and believed it and tried to put it in place. And the state has to control the production and the wages. And what if you read Thomas Sowell has a very difficult, dry, but highly intellectual analysis, a scholarly analysis of Marx. It takes some fortitude to get through it. But what he ultimately points out is the state really is incapable of controlling productions and wages in a way that generates wealth. They just can't do it. They can't respond quick enough. It's on paper, it's simple. We'll control the price of a car. In reality, there's part suppliers from all over the world that provide all different kinds of parts, and you got to control and price all that. and set the wages for the employees, and you've got to tell every factory how many widgets to make, and nobody can do it. And so it always fails and produces, poverty and famine. So in practices, though, in practice, the states always have to have absolute power. The only way you can control everything, production, wages, uh, you know, you control every aspect of the economy. You have to have absolute power. And what they do is they rigidly enforce atheism. It's an interesting phenomenon because you need the people to look to the state as its God, its idol. The state is everything. And so if you just look at the history of USSR, Russia, North Korea, you'll find that they're heavily atheistic. The USSR, under Stalin, persecuted and murdered scientists who were teaching the Big Bang Theory because they knew it implied a creator, and you can't have that. And this is a popular way of thinking today that we need, whether you want to call it socialism or communism, we need to try to do what China, North Korea, and USSR did, and that means eradicating theism and Christianity. So it is a threat in that way. Well, we shall stop there. I just had a couple more slides, but next time we'll get into, as I said, the practical side, having kind of just thought about what our culture thinks and how it got to where it's thinking, sort of, we've talked about how the people on Mars Hill think. Now we know Paul went and had a good discussion with them. That's what I want to focus on next. How do we do that? So I will stop the recording